I am so glad all of you are here. Thank you for being here. It's a great day for recharge outside. Getting some water in the ground for our wetlands. This is one of several events that we're having as the inauguration of the Paul W. Kirk Wetland Research Program. And very glad that you're here to participate in this. Dr. Kirk, for those of you that perhaps missed Harry Marshall's wonderful explanation last evening, was a longtime faculty member here at ODU, had great interest in quite a number of things as a faculty member in biological sciences, one of which, of course, was the Dismal Swamp, and produced a major work on that, for which he's very well known. He died recently. The Kirk family is memorializing Dr. Kirk with a gift to the university that's going to be used to support student research for wetland projects for the next several years. As part of the committee with Lytton Musselman and headed by Frank Day, we could sit back and pontificate that we know what is really the best thing for these students to be working on, but anybody that's worked in wetlands certainly realizes that nobody's got all of the answers. And so what we came up with was the idea of getting together some wise, experienced folks who have had experiences in a variety of different wetland situations for different reasons here, not only in southeastern part of Virginia, but many other places as well, and to pick their brains for a while. The purpose of this is to create a white paper, to have a summary of the ideas that all of us together perhaps can come together on and agree that these are some major issues that need to be addressed, and to be able to hand this then to students and to perhaps future faculty members and grow with that. So what we have invited our panelists to do is to come and really address the question of what kinds of research issues are out there that we need to address right now as the scientific community in order to better protect or sustain the wetlands that we have. And so what we're going to do here, folks, is to proceed. I think I've got everybody organized the way down the line I wish. I will introduce everyone very briefly, and I'd like the folks to very briefly let you know where they are coming from as far as wetlands are concerned, what their interests are and experiences are very briefly, and then explain 2 or 3 problems that they think need to be addressed, and then by a quick wrap-up to give us some kind of notion as to who might care in terms of organizations or people or individuals that would be interested in supporting perhaps further research in those kinds of areas beyond perhaps what the students can do, or even perhaps provide funding sources. After we are done with that, we definitely want to get questions, additional comments, any ideas from the rest of you as well in an open forum sort of thing. And because we need to produce this white paper and Frank Day can only write so fast, we are filming this and going to be recording it for the purposes of the archive, not for putting on YouTube or anything. So with that in mind, let me introduce our first panelist here. Harold Jones is a longtime friend of the university here in a variety of ways. He has a long career as chief of the regulatory group down at the Norfolk office of the Army Corps of Engineers. And as I was noting, the makeup of the group, by the way, is sort of like what happens at typical SWS meetings, Society of Wetland Scientists meetings. There might be 10% hydrologists, 10% soil scientists, and all the rest are ecologists and botanists. And that's sort of what has happened here. So I'm glad Harold is here as a soil scientist as well.
Oh, no, it wouldn't go quite that far.
Wouldn't go quite that far. Okay. Harold, you got the floor.
Yeah, just by one of the things that we were asked to do is just give you a little bit of background in terms of where we're coming from, both educationally and from experience-wise. I've got degrees in natural resources conservation, in biology, and in wetland biology. I've worked in a variety of different positions with the federal government for going on 32 years before I retired 10 years ago in those positions. The last one was with the Army Corps of Engineers as a regulatory section chief. That was about 16 years in length and 20 years with the Corps. And prior positions with the Fish and Wildlife Service, especially with Back Bay National Wildlife Refuge, Montezuma, and Iroquois National Wildlife Refuges, and with the U.S. Forest Service. So, and the Forest Service was out in northern Idaho. So I've had some experiences all around the country, and that has been more than helpful in trying to develop my individual perspectives, especially in wetland science. For those that do know me, know that I live down in the southern watersheds of Virginia Beach, down in the Sandbridge area, and in the lower part of what used to be Princess Anne County. And as such, I've had worked and played an awful lot in Back Bay and North Bay. And for those folks that aren't familiar with Back Bay and North Bay, they are at the extreme upper ends of the Pamlico Sound, which is obviously a tidal water body, but the restrictions at Knott's Island are such that the waters north of that, i.e. farther upstream, are wind-dependent tidal, and which means that there is really no predictability on what the water depth is going to be in North Bay or Back Bay unless you start to take a look at what the winds are going to be. And there has been times in the past where I have gone out and walked across North Bay, and it's a solid sand bottom out there once you get past the near zone mud. At any rate, because the water depth is so unpredictable and subject to wind, there's a tremendous amount of variation in the hydro period that supports the entire aquatic system, including wetlands. If we're taking a look at projected rates of sea level rise over the next years or decades, there's going to be substantial, at least in my opinion, there's going to be substantial changes to the hydro period based on rising water levels within the Pamlico Sound, and therefore there's going to be a different hydro period in these areas. And the concern that I have is quite a few concerns, actually. With the changing in the hydro period, and if you take a static average, let's just say, we'll call it mean high water, for lack of a better term, or an appropriate term, I should say, if that really does rise, and because a lot of the surrounding area is in agricultural fields that are very, very low. A lot of them are farmed wetlands. A lot of them are prior converted wetlands. There's going to be a greater duration and a greater frequency of inundation of both floodwaters coming in out of North Bay, Back Bay, and at the same time, there's likely to be a little bit higher or a raise in salinity because of the greater amount of water that's coming up from the Pamlico Sound. That can cause effects on not only the composition of the wetlands and the flora and fauna that's actually within the bay itself, but it provides a greater interface for the agricultural runoff and all the associated nutrients, pollutants, sediments that's coming back in. So we're going to see a greater amount of interface. And I guess the questions that I would think that needs to be answered is how are those effects going to be manifested? How are we going to measure them? How is it going to impact the agricultural community? How is it going to impact many of the stakeholders around North Bay and Back Bay? Obviously, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the wildlife management areas for the state game and inland fisheries, the agricultural community, Falls Cape State Park, and the residential areas. So one can only just imagine just the whole suite of things really to take a look at. I mean, it could be water quality, it could be species composition, biodiversity, impacts on agriculture and the like. So I would just sort of throw that out for somebody out there for people to think about. The second area that I've done a lot of work in, I've had a research permit with DCR for about 10 years on Falls Cape State Park doing work in Unaduna swales. And I started that, and I'm still currently a member of EPA's Middle Atlantic Hydric Soils Committee. And we've been taking a look at the development of redoxymorphic features, and ultimately with the goal of coming up with new field indicators for hydric soils in these interdunal swales. And we've been collecting data now for about 10 years in this one swale in particular. And we have found out through various other efforts by others that we're really looking at a system with a perched water table that has two separate aquifers associated with it that are separated by, in some places, very thin aquitine. And with sea level rise, there possibly will be a tendency for the saline aquifer to begin to migrate upward and interface and interchange with the freshwater and the supporting hydrology in these perched dunal swales. So again, trying to take a look at the shifts in the plant community, trying to take a look at changes in the development of different soil constituents as we see a rate the rates of salinity increase within these bottom zones, and how those effects are manifested in species composition and community composition within these swales. So again, ideas that I think are worthy of folks taking a look at additional investigative work in.
Any guesses on funding? Who might be interested in helping out?
I would normally say that the Fish and Wildlife Service, but I know right now the Back Bay National Wildlife Refuge is cutting back on services because they've been cut, their funding has been cut back. So I don't think it would come from the refuge itself. It might come from other arms of the Fish and Wildlife Service or maybe Interior.
Okay.
But the stakeholders there too, again, are in some ways the City of Virginia Beach, the state resources. Obviously you got Falls Cave State Park, and protection of the interdunal swales. I mean, because every swale out there is unique. I mean, there's no two interdunal swales that are exactly the same, and we may have some swales that have got 100 and 105% vegetated cover on, and there's some swales that might be 2% or 3%. So they're entirely different. A lot of similarities, but again, I think the protection is fairly good on the lands that are owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state and federal agencies, but lands that are privately owned or even in some government possession where protection is not always assured. So
okay.
Look at organizations that may want to offer protection.
Thank you. Federal regulation direction too, from perspective from Harold, and Michelle Henachek can bring us some of the state level protection ideas. She's a senior wetland ecologist with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, and certainly is one of those helping to protect the wetlands here from the Virginia side. Michelle.
During college, I interned at VDOT in their water quality section, so that kind of got me into the wetlands arena. After graduation, I went into consulting and delineating wetlands, where great people like Harold confirmed my delineations and all. And then I joined DEQ in 2001 as a BWP permit writer, issuing permits. And then a couple years later, I was promoted to the senior wetland ecologist, where I developed and managed DEQ's wetland monitoring and assessment program, and the grants that have been awarded by EPA through that. So the majority of my time has been devoted here lately, the past couple years, to working closely with BEMS to develop and implement a wetland monitoring and assessment model to assess the current health of our wetlands across the state. I would say that I guess the concern is for us is that DEQ is tasked with having to balance land development, and also wetland health, you know, as in trying to preserve wetlands as much as possible in the permitting process, but still allow development. So we're tasked with finding a balance between the two. So I've worked with VIMS to develop a new geographic system web tool that basically is known as the Wetland Condition Assessment Tool, and it will give accessible location-based wetland data to governments and permit writers and citizens. The goal is basically to empower conservation as well as wise governmental decision making. VIMS took a three-stage approach to compiling all the data on wetlands for our new WetCat system. And first, the VIMS scientists, they used a slew of geographic data to account for all the wetlands in the state. And it took them about a year of running 4 computers 24/7 to crunch all the data. It was crazy. So then they rapidly assessed the wetlands based on land stressors like parking lots, ditches, culverts, row crops, stuff like that. And then once they observed a wide range of the affected wetlands, they applied their findings through statistically analysis to all non-tidal wetlands across the state. And the analysis basically gave them the baseline data of information about wetland conditions in relation to areas surrounding them. And then they went out and they field sampled as part of the level 2 portion of it. They field sampled wetlands for biological data and water quality to see how the results related to the modeling. And then once the computers finished crunching all that information, we could see how different types of land affected the wetlands across the state, and how that established like a baseline land use metrics, which gave us an idea of how human impacts affect wetlands and wetland areas. And then WetCat, it scores each wetland in the database based on its proximity to like roads and percent land cover, among a bunch of other factors. So the new WetCat database will basically give those monitoring wetland health a reference to examine restoration and mitigation. The new tool will be able to allow property owners and developers who want to minimize cost and still develop in their areas. It will be able to give them an overall big picture view of the cumulative effects in their area. So basically the goal of WetCat is to support DEQ, regulatory decision making, and allow for reporting of wetland condition, and also provide information for policy development. And as in who might be interested, we've been working with the Corps as well as VDOT, and both agencies are very interested in it. VDOT especially because they see a need to use it during their NEPA process prior to actually getting into the permitting process. So we actually modified WetCat to assess linear transportation projects through our last grant, EPA grant funded grant. And so now we're thinking that the Federal Highways Administration, we're going to go to them as well because we feel like they may be interested in maybe funding some future technical support and implementation associated with WetCat to add additional layers and additional data sets. And we're actually going to push this out to the public and introduce it and show how to use it and all at the next VAWP meeting, which is going to be held at VIMS on June 3rd. So if anybody's interested in actually seeing it live and how to use it, that's when we're going to show it to everybody.
Thank you. Skip Stiles is Executive Director of Wetlands Watch. I think 2001 is when actually got started around here, so you've been out preaching the gospel about wetlands and now sea level rise to anyone who could listen for quite a long time, and Skip has really contributed quite a bit to the conversation here locally. Glad you're here.
Thank you. And we're a statewide nonprofit environmental group. We work on tidal and non-tidal wetlands. We work on the conservation and protection of wetlands in a number of ways. We issue a number of what our colleagues call nerdy policy papers on issues and problems that we face, and then we do direct advocacy. We work with or against these two agencies to make sure that stupid development isn't put on top of or adjacent to wetlands wherever possible. In the course of that work, we discovered that actually Bert Polari from DEQ taught me this early on, once the land use is changed on a piece of land, the hands of the regulatory agencies are pretty much tied. And so we have moved from operating in the regulatory arena to working at the local government land use level. So we spend a lot of time with planning commissions, we spend a lot of time with city and county planners, trying to keep land that is of critical value either adjacent to or on top of wetlands and critical shoreline habitat from being zoned so that it can be developed. So that's where we operate much of the time these days. In 2006-07, we had Carl Hirschner from VIMS come and brief our board about sea level rise, and at that point our agenda sort of switched because, you know, we were out there saving little postage stamp sized pieces of land, and what we were looking at least for the tidal ecosystem, were tremendous losses. Now, the tidal wetlands inventory in the state's 30 years old. It's sort of, and at the time there were no good maps. So we took all this bad data and a little bit of good scotch and estimated that we would lose between 50 and 80% of the vegetated tidal wetlands in Virginia with what in 2007 was projected to be 2.5 feet of sea level rise over the next 100 years. Our rate up to now has been 1.5 feet. We thought then it would go to 2.5 feet. I was on the Climate Commission in 2008. We said, yeah, 2.5 feet. With some work that's been done at VIMS and here at ODU by Tal Ezer, it now looks like it's more like 4 to 6 feet. And so there's tremendous impacts coming to the tidal and tidal fresh wetlands in the state of Virginia. So we've spent most of the last 7 or 8 years working on sea level rise adaptation, again at the local government level, trying to make sure that shorelines are kept open and that land adjacent to wetlands is kept open as well in order to increase the value and survivability of those wetlands. So that's sort of where we operate. In terms of some of the issues that we see going forward, again, you know, we'll sort of step into this through our climate change doorway. We're very, very concerned about what happens to tidal wetlands. What is the rate of accretion? Wetlands, Court Stevenson from Maryland sort of guesstimated that wetlands in this region can move vertically about 2 foot a century. Well, that's obviously not going to be enough. So what is the true rate of accretion of wetlands? This is an open issue. It's been one that's been mentioned a lot as people have begun to get into sea level rise. What's the rate of landward transgression? How do these things move uphill? How do these wetlands ecosystems move uphill, and at what rate? And is that going to keep pace with what looks now like at least a doubling of the rate of sea level rise that we've seen over the last 100 years? There's a whole suite of issues about, yeah, like I'm a shoreline landowner and I'm just going to let the wetlands come onto my land that I've paid for. I don't think so. I'm going to put a bulkhead in. So there's a whole lot of issues around future land use and what that's going to do. A lot of this was just this week brought into focus with some work that I saw in Bay Journal. They talked about some work that VIMS has been doing under an EPA grant remapping the tidal wetlands in the York River watershed up into the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi as well. And they found a net loss of about 1,800 acres of tidal wetlands over the last 30 years, which again was the last time they did a real inventory. Fringe marsh was more like a loss of 30%. The critical habitat and tidal fresh areas for nesting, tremendous impacts on rails and other birds that nest and use that habitat because of the increased flooding of the nest. So there's a whole, I mean, right now, today, you know, one watershed up, we're seeing clear evidence that there is change and that change is going to accelerate. The next step of the work that Center for Coastal Resource Management and Denise Wardrop and some other people are going to do is to begin to look at the functionality of those wetlands to try to figure out, okay, you know, what's going on with that loss? What happens with those fringe marshes? How much nitrogen are they taking out? And if they're disappearing at a rate of 30%, do we ever meet our bay nitrogen reduction goals unless we take care of the wetlands? So there's a whole host of issues that need to be done about functionality of wetlands, rates of accretion, rates of transgression. People talk about using living shorelines as an adaptation strategy. Does it work? Has anyone actually put a living wetland in and elevated it to keep pace with the sea level rise? Can you? It certainly makes the shoreline more resilient than a bulkhead. But longer term, what happens to that living shoreline? It's an interesting concept, but I know when Carl Hirscher and some of the folks at VIMS tried to elevate wetlands up on the Pamunkey, it was pretty hard to do. So that's an issue that I think needs to be looked at. For non-tidal wetlands, you know, there's a tremendous disruption that is projected. It's been happening, but it's projected in the future in the hydrologic cycle. We've seen an 11% increase in storm intensity over the last 30 years. We're seeing periods of drought and rain. And what happens to non-tidal wetlands in this situation? They're already seeing a loss of fens and bogs in New England because the drought cycles are getting longer, and they're so long now that the ability of these systems to respond to normal periods of drought is being overwhelmed, and they're actually getting knocked out. And when there is rain, it tends to be flashy. It tends to be in big bunches that don't allow the infiltration into these old marshes. So that's an issue that needs to be studied. Who's going to pay for it? The reality is that federal agencies are all under stress, and I spent 22 years working in Congress and oversaw a whole lot of federal agency budgets. Every time they're under stress, they pay for themselves. So NOAA, which is one satellite short of where it needs to be, that's a few $billion bucks, has a large core of ships and a lot of employees. EPA, labs and employees. Fish and Wildlife, a lot of facilities that need to be taken care of. What happens during periods of financial stress is you pull your money inward, and there's not a whole lot of extramural money to fund this kind of work. And that's going to be a problem going forward. So this morning, while I was driving in from where we're staying at Sandbridge, I thought, you know what, here's an idea. If we know that we lost 1,800 acres in the last 30 years, and we know that a doubling will mean that in the next 15 years we're going to lose probably another 30%. 15 years in regulatory terms is what they call under the National Environmental Policy Act a reasonably foreseeable future. None of these losses are being taken into account when we're doing cumulative impact statements on wetlands permits because we didn't know about them. We don't know about them. So I'm thinking, well, if an enterprising and agitated environmental group were to file a lawsuit against a permit alleging that it hadn't taken the cumulative impacts into account from sea level rise and sought an injunction for the issuance of further permits, I bet a lot of money would be freed up from the Corps of Engineers and private developers to study just what the heck is going on with these wetlands. So I'll just leave that.
Thank you, Skip. Jim Perry, gentleman who has a lot of roots here at ODU. Won't go into all of the details of that, but he may explain some. He is now a professor of marine studies at VIMS and I believe president, correct, of SWS, International Society of Wetland Scientists. Glad you're here, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Rich. As Rich said, I'm a professor of marine science at VIMS. I am, by the way, a scientist. I'm not a manager. I do most of my work on a scientific basis. Most of what we look at in my lab is changes in vegetation dynamics, what environmental factors drive those changes in those dynamics, how those changes may impact the physiology of plants, thus the growth of the plants, and what about ecological function in created and restored wetlands where we have tremendous environmental changes take place over time. Hi, Walter. I just noticed you sitting there. So we're looking very much at what changes take place in these systems. We're trying to figure out the physiology, which helps us understand how those changes are going to drive our systems. One of the things that we realize is that the physical environment is a driver of our wetland systems. Without understanding the physiological processes that underlie the changes, we're basically barking up the wrong tree. A couple of the things that I want to talk about that really need addressing. Skip's talked about sea level change. Well, there's a couple of things going on with sea level change that are really quite fascinating and potentially very damaging to humanity. One of the things I always do when I look at my work is I try to relate that back to society. How is it going to impact people? Well, one of the things we're seeing is landward movement of our marshes, of our tidal marshes, due to the influence of increases in salt and increases in inundation due to sea level rise. As this moves our systems upstream, we are seeing a crunch take place. Now, we have a suite of diverse landscape types. We have tidal salt marshes, oligohaline marshes, tidal freshwater marshes, tidal hardwood swamps, all the way up into the headwater systems. Now, one of the problems we perceive, and we quite sure is going to occur, is that tidal hardwood swamps, which are a large carbon component, provides a tremendous amount of carbon to the estuaries, which drive the turbidity wedges, which drive our fisheries in our estuaries, are going to disappear. They're going to be pushed out of the system. As the water rises, there is no place for them to go. Overall, what we anticipate is over time, we are going to lose that landscape diversity. We're going to lose our tidal hardwood swamps. We're going to lose our tidal freshwater swamps. It may be 100 years, but it's going to happen. So we are going to go from a very landscape diverse system to one of a fairly monotypic stand of salt marshes. What impact is that going to have on the carbon released into the estuary? And in turn, how is that going to impact the different trophic structures in that estuary? Fish rely upon these systems. If we lose them, what is going to happen to the fishery stocks in the Chesapeake Bay? We do not know. That is a study that's going to require physical oceanographers, biological oceanographers, wetlands ecologists, hydrologists, sedimentation people to look at it from a very, very diverse point of view and try to tie those together. Are we going to be losing a trophic system, or are we going to see a total trophic system change in our estuary due to landscape loss? Good funding source, something like that. You put together a good team across universities, you've got National Science Foundation. Okay, second thing I want to talk about, something I think is also very germane right now, is marsh dieback. I don't know if you have a problem down here, but we've noticed along the eastern shore of Virginia, we're seeing a tremendous amount of dieback. Now, there's been a lot of studies that show dieback can be caused for a number of different things in salt marshes. It could be geese, it could be crabs, it can be parasites, microparasites in the soil, it can be eutrophication, but there are many, many different things that could cause them. Do we have a dieback problem? On the eastern shore, we definitely do. So one of the things we're looking at is putting together a team to look at the extent of the dieback in the eastern shore region and what may be causing that dieback. Is it really a problem? And what may it indicate as far, again, as the estuary systems adjacent to those wetland systems? There we're looking at funding through NASA and Wallops Island. They've been talking with us about how we might go about it. There's an opportunity to work together with VIMS, Old Dominion, Virginia Tech, as a team. Finally, I'll pick on one last thing, mitigation banking. I am concerned, mitigation banking, of course, many of you know, has become politically very, very worldly. It's a good money-making scheme for bankers. It's actually worked very well in creating some very large wetland systems. However, in many cases, what we're doing is we're taking small isolated wetlands that are being lost to construction projects, and we're replacing them with large, banks. So we're taking many small, for example, 199 in Williamsburg, when they put that through, they destroyed 7 little small headwater wetland systems. For mitigation, what they did is they built a bank in Charles City, which of course is not Williamsburg, in Charles City, that was approximately 50 hectares in size. So now you have these 7 small individual wetland systems replaced by one large system, but also replaced in a non-urban area. They were replaced in a rural system. The land was cheaper. They couldn't afford to do it in Williamsburg. Okay, so what does that do? Do these have the opportunity now to serve the same functions that these small isolated systems had while they were in Williamsburg? When you create a wetland system or when you restore a wetland system, what happens to the ecological function? How long does it take those systems to come up to par to reproduce the ecological aspects that are required by law? The law literally states you will replace the ecological functions. Well, how long does that take? A lot of our data is showing us a lot longer than we thought. Okay. So that's something else that really needs to be explored. We need to look at, are we hurting ourselves by getting rid of our urban small systems, by replacing them with these large banks? Are these large banks functioning in the same landscape process that we would find in the isolated systems or the small systems? We don't know. Who's going to fund something like that? Well, I can tell you right now, politicians don't want to know. They want it to work. Money be made, this is nice. But there are other agencies that do look at that. EPA, Corps of Engineers, USDA, a bunch of groups are out looking at that. USGS. So again, it's an opportunity. It's a long-term study that's going to take different types of scientists. It's not going to be just one person. It's got to be a hydrologist, a soil scientist, a botanist, physical oceanographer, again, somebody to look at sediment processes. So the idea of working together is what I'm going to push today. I'd really like to see Old Dominion, William & Mary, Virginia Tech, and UVA come together as a group and start doing some of these projects as teams, instead of looking at what can we do individually. That's my soapbox.
Thank you, Tim. Dick Zimmerman's professor over in Ocean, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences here on ODU campus. I've always put you on the spot, Dick. I've always been impressed about his ability to think out of the box and see a bigger picture than most of the rest of us do. And so, Dick, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Rich. Yeah, as Rich said, I'm on the faculty here at ODU in Ocean, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences. And my background is in biological oceanography, plant physiology, and optical oceanography, which involves understanding the propagation of light through natural waters. And in our lab, we do fundamental basic research on factors that control the primary production of coastal marine ecosystems. And I started working on this as a graduate student, working on giant kelp forests, and then I've worked on coastal upwelling systems on the California coast, and then got involved in seagrass ecosystems several years ago. And so I work right now in my lab, we work on the deep water end of the estuarine gradient that Irv and Karen were talking about last night. And so the plants, the systems that we're involved with, they're not so impacted by sea level rise as some of the emergent wetlands are, but they have been definitely impacted by water quality and climate change impacts in the around the world. In fact, it's estimated that globally, seagrass resources, which are almost as valuable, if you remember Irv and Karen's chart last night, seagrass systems are probably the second most valuable aquatic resource next to the emergent wetlands themselves, which, if you combine them, are more valuable than the entire open ocean, just those two systems themselves. We have probably lost 60 to 80% of the global seagrass resources in the last 50 years. And in the Chesapeake Bay, it's estimated that we've lost 95% of the historic seagrass resources that used to exist, submerged aquatic vegetation, as well as seagrasses that used to exist throughout the bay. People estimate that the seagrasses grew to depths of 3 meters prior to the industrialization of the bay system 100 years ago. And right now, the Maryland DNR, Virginia DEQ, EPA, everybody's goal for restoration of seagrasses or an SAV back into the Chesapeake Bay system is calling for getting them to grow to the 1 meter isobath, which represents about 10% of the historic distribution of the plants. So that's the goal. Where they are is about half of that. So they've restored it to about 5% of the historic distribution. The goal is to get it to 10%. 10%. So in my lab, we've been spending a lot of time. We do fundamental plant physiology, biochemistry, and use laboratory experiments to build mathematical models, which we then take out into the field and see if we can validate those models in natural populations using a variety of techniques. And in the last few years, we've been engaging in using remote sensing and radiator transfer modeling to predict the distributions of plants across the submarine landscape based on water quality issues, and then see if we can actually validate those models using remote sensing tools. One of the interesting things about seagrasses is that they are one of the, among marine plants, they are severely carbon limited in terms of their photosynthetic capacity. That is, the more CO2 you give them, the more photosynthesis they do, which is unusual for marine plants, which means that in the coming climate change environment of global warming, sea level rise, and ocean acidification, seagrasses may be among some of the winners because they're going to at least respond positively to increased CO2. And we've been doing experiments with that in the last few years at Virginia Aquarium, where we've actually been looking at the combined impacts of temperature and CO2 availability on the plants, and we're just getting ready to publish those results now. But basically it shows that if you increase the CO2 availability of the plants, you can increase their thermal tolerance, which suggests that plants in the Chesapeake Bay region may be able to survive into the future into a warmer climate environment because CO2 is also going to rise, and that'll give them a little bit of a buffer against that. And that has an important management issue because among the managers of submerged vegetation resources in the Bay, there is a lot of concern that maybe we ought to stop spending all this money trying to restore SAV to these environments, because with global warming, it's just going to further stress the plants than knock them out anyway, and there's nothing we can do about it. I think our results are showing that, in fact, although I'm not an advocate for ocean acidification as an environmental remediation tool, in this case, we're identifying some systems that might potentially be winners that might ameliorate some of the other negative impacts that give these systems at least a chance to survive into the future. And our funding in our lab comes primarily from basic science sources, primarily from NSF and from NASA for developing radiator transfer models. And we've also gotten some funding recently from Virginia Sea Grant and now the EPA to try to transfer our models into management-related tools that will help us predict SAV distributions in the Chesapeake Bay as a function of water quality. And we've got a couple of posters up in the back from our dissertation work from a couple of our students who are actually in the audience today. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dick. Karen McKee is a retired scientist emeritus with a long career with U.S. Geological Survey, the biological group there, and also has connections with LSU. Glad you're here, Karen.
Thanks. Well, just a brief background. I'm actually trained as a botanist, specifically plant ecology, and I started studying wetlands in 1973. Studied how wetland plants adapt to their environment, flooding and salinity. But then I transitioned more into ecological studies, looking at wetland functioning, primary production, decomposition, and processes like that. And then more recently, I've focused on the impacts of global factors such as elevated CO2, climate extremes, and of course sea level rise on wetlands, and then how wetlands respond to those various global change factors. So I'm going to sort of look at things from my perspective as a researcher and talk about perhaps some gaps in information, and there are a lot of gaps that are out there, and I'm doing this for the students that are in the audience here, because presumably you're the ones who are going to be doing some of this research that's going to be funded by this program. My interest more recently has been in terms of how wetlands respond to sea level rise. And until recently, the emphasis has been on sedimentation, mineral sediment. And this has been driven by geologists who study these processes. But more recently, some of my research and research of colleagues has shown that the plant community can have a major impact on accretion processes. And not only from the standpoint of the plants and their roots trapping and consolidating the sediment and preventing erosion, but they actually directly contribute to soil volume and upward expansion of the soil surface. And I should mention here that it's important to understand that accretion, that is the deposition of material on the soil surface, is not the same thing as elevation change. You can have a system that has an input of sediment accreting at a rate of 1 or 2 centimeters per year, but that system can be losing elevation because of subsidence. And that's information that is often lacking for a lot of wetland areas, is how much subsidence is occurring under the surface. And then the other gap, which I'm mostly interested in, are the processes that actually contribute to biogenic accretion, the contribution of the plants. Is it below ground material that's accumulating? Is it the above ground material? What are the actual processes? Are there algal communities or biofilms that form on the soil surface that help trap and consolidate those mineral sediments that are being deposited and limit their resuspension on subsequent tides and currents and that sort of thing? And I think this has management implications, because if you think about it, if plants are contributing to accretion and counterbalancing relative sea level rise, which, if you're doing a restoration project, which species do you select to promote the optimum amount of biogenic accretion? That information isn't out there. Some of the species that I've worked with, we've noticed distinct differences in the capacity of different species to, 1, accrete mineral sediment and hold it, and 2, contribute organic matter. They are very strong producers of below ground biomass, for example. One species that I was talking about with a student earlier is Shinoplectus americanus, and we started jokingly calling it the accretionator, sort of a play on the term the terminator, because it seemed to be so good at accumulating organic matter. And of course, a number of species are more responsive to CO2 than other species. And so along with sea level rise, of course, CO2 is going to be increasing in the atmosphere. How do you plan for a plant community, or manage for it, or restore a community and select the species that are going to be the best mixture of organisms that are going to be able to match the rate of sea level rise in that system? So there are a lot of questions, I think, out there. Another one is, what's the maximum rate of sea level rise that different wetland types can accommodate? As far as I know, there's no real information on that. We can get some information about that looking at paleo-environmental records. How fast has sea level risen in the past, and which systems have managed to persist under those sea level rise scenarios? Well, that gives us a potential rate, but the conditions in the past are no longer here today, especially with human activities. What human activities are compromising the capacity of wetlands to respond to sea level rise? So those are just a few ideas, and I think funding agencies like EPA, NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who are concerned about protecting and conserving coastal wetlands, would be interested in that type of information. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. Irv Mendelson is a emeritus professor at LSU. They're in the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences. And before I escape the chance, I do want to thank both of you two for the wonderful presentation last evening.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here, certainly. Well, being the last speaker, I can say everything I was going to say has already been said, and we can leave at this point. Well, first of all, my background is I'm a wetland plant ecologist. I started my work here on the East Coast, actually in Virginia, 40-some years ago as a graduate student at VIMS. And then I moved down to North Carolina State University, where I studied coastal salt marshes in the Wilmington, Southport area in the southern part of North Carolina, and got a degree in botany. And then from there, I moved on to where I stayed my whole career, Louisiana State University, where I, in my laboratory, investigated controls on the health and the primary productivity of coastal vegetation primarily, but also work in freshwater marshes and swamps as well. And throughout my career, my emphasis, as I think with some others here on the panel, has been understanding the processes and the factors involved in controlling the growth and health of coastal wetland vegetation. Much of my work has been centered around the Mississippi River system because of so much that's going on there of interest. But also I've worked in other states in the U.S., including San Francisco, or California, San Francisco Bay, and Texas, and Georgia. I've done coastal wetland work in Mexico and in Canada. I've worked in actual research, extended research in New Zealand, Australia, China, in Europe and Portugal for 3 years, in the Netherlands for another year approximately, and then another for 10 years working with people at Aarhus University in Denmark and studying wetlands there. So I have a broad range of experiences even outside the Gulf. And the approach I took in answering these questions was more of a generalist approach, and I'm not sure if it's going to help graduate students in particular, but maybe it would help the overall program. So I have 4 problems that I identified that I think could be interesting questions, interesting problems to pursue on a programmatic basis for this program. And the first one that I thought about was the problem of wetland stability or sustainability, including restoration in a changing world. Here we have obviously an environment that's going to be changing in the years to come, whether they're through global change, man-induced change, human-induced changes, or other changes. And the question is, how are those global changes going to influence the processes that maintain the stability of coastal wetlands? As Karen was talking about, the ability to vertically accrete and build elevation as the environment changes, and also how will those changes affect our restoration approaches? And that was mentioned by some of the speakers here. Will our restoration have to take a really dramatic shift in a new directions, not trying to restore what we had, but rather to try to prepare the upslope environments for the migration of wetlands that will likely occur as sea level rises. So that's one area of interest to me and concern. And I think a solution for this is a systematic approach to evaluating the important factors that control these processes from an interactive standpoint. Studies of multiple stressors, multiple disturbances. Looking at one factor alone is a thing of the past because these stressors, these disturbances are working in a suite of changing environmental factors. So multiple interactions, multiple stressors, both in field studies and in macro or mesocosm studies within more controlled laboratory or conditions. And I'll get to agencies in a moment. Another problem that I think it was definitely mentioned, is this trying to develop an understanding of how the environment, this environmental change that we're expecting to see, will alter trophic links between coastal wetlands and fisheries, and secondary productivity just in general. That's obviously an area of concern. It was mentioned by one of the other speakers. How are our coastal fisheries going to be affected by the changes that are likely to be seen in wetland structure and function? And here again, I certainly applaud this idea that Jim mentioned of multidisciplinary, multi-investigator, multi-university interactions to tackle these big questions, because no individual discipline, no individual scientist can do it adequately. Of course, this takes big money and or large funding, and that's always a concern. But this field and macrocosm research to evaluate these trophic links and how the trophic links change as a result of environmental change is obviously an area of interest and concern. Another major problem area that I see is the problem of inadequate ecological predictions, the inability to predict changes in the future. And that's, of course, not only for wetlands, but for all natural ecosystems. It's very difficult for us as ecologists to be able to predict changes in the future. And I like to use the analogy, okay, wetlands, you always hear, wetland science is not rocket science. Well, it's actually more difficult than rocket science. We can add 2 + 2 is equal to 4 here on Earth. Well, that addition is the same on the moon. 2 + 2 = 4. The physics and mathematics of rocket science doesn't change unless we're getting close to the speed of light, right? So on the other hand, if we have an ecological problem, we're adding nutrients to a wetland in Louisiana versus nutrient runoff to a wetland in the Chesapeake Bay or New England, the results of the nutrient additions can be extremely different depending on the species composition of that wetland, the hydrology of that wetland, the soil type, you can go on and on and on. So obviously, ecological prediction is something we fail at in almost all of our natural ecosystems. So this is certainly a general area of concern. How do we approach it? Well, what's the solution? Again, it's multi-investigator studies, it's the use of ecological modeling, which is done, and there's been a lot of emphasis recently on structural equation modeling, which appears to be a very powerful tool for predicting the responses of systems to multiple stressors. And Jim Grace, who's a member of the Society of Wetland Science has definitely promoted that area. And then finally, there's a problem with inadequate synthesis of data and the ability to scale up from our plot experiments in the field to watershed results, watershed implications. And to me, this is, the concept here is, we come into, even in this panel, I see it, we come into the question of what are the important ecological controls on wetlands based on our baggage, based on our bias. Okay, I've worked primarily in the Gulf of Mexico, others have worked primarily in the Chesapeake Bay, maybe Dick is an ecophysiologist, someone else is a landscape ecologist, and we tend to address and in some ways are biased by this baggage that we hold with us. And I'm sure all of you who have some age on you have experienced this. I have a colleague, not in Louisiana, in another state, who believes that marsh dieback is definitely due to hypersaline conditions. My approach, and that's because salinity drives some of the marshes that he's been working in. There's another colleague who says it's top-down control. It's herbivores. It's those damn crabs and snails that are killing the marshes. And I'm a bottom-up guy. So I tend to think it's the environment. It's too much flooding. It's sulfide. It's a variety of other things, environmental factors. So we come into this with our own baggage. And it dawned on me that what we need is a synthesis. We need to go beyond our own individual ecological, geographical baggage. And we have to bring people together in very narrow, in a sense, narrow workshops. Workshops that involve people who approach a particular question, but from different angles, ecologically, and from different geographical areas in order to synthesize what we understand today and where should we go forward to attack the primary questions driving whether wetlands are going to be sustainable in the future, how are they going to change, and how is that going to affect society and the ecosystem services that we talked about yesterday that are derived from wetlands. And what agencies might support these larger scale problems that I see? Well, I think it's all the agencies we've been discussing, from NSF to NOAA to EPA to the Corps. All these agencies have a reason to support this type of larger scale kind of ideas. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, all of you. These are very stimulating ideas. In fact, just for a quick break, let's give them all a hand for their contribution. Because at this point, I want to open the floor to comments. Others of you may have things you wish to stress as well, or questions for the panelists, or panelists may want to question other panelists. And I think we have folks with microphones here. So, floor is open. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. Victoria Hill, Ocean, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, ODU. I see that this is a funding question, that the common theme from all of the panelists was that this kind of understanding of wetlands is going to take interdisciplinary funding, and that is expensive. I'm thinking the kind of NSF level $10 million per funding cycle for many funding cycles. And thinking to some of the recent large projects that have been funded, like the NASA Icescape in the Arctic, to look at one particular location in the Arctic, the ocean acidification from NSF that was, I think, 2 rounds of funding purely for ocean acidification. So how can we as the community get maybe a cross-federal agency program going that will last many cycles and that will have this really large funding to go with it? Is that something that has been started, or can we start it?
I think part of this is just talking to each other here today And there are, I've worked with Frank, I've worked with Rich, I've worked with Lee Daniels at Tech and Carlton Ray at UVA. So there are a lot of people who are willing to work across the table. We need to sit down and a lot of us have the NSF experience. We need to sit down together as a group, put a forum together, and put their ideas on the table and say, let's go for it.
I think if the community, if we say this has got to be done, like they did with ocean acidification and other studies too, then maybe we can get this level of funding.
And I think if we took something like the Chesapeake Bay, there's enough interest there in DC area that we're probably going to shake some heads. And it's not going to be just NSF. NOAA has funding for things of that nature. USGS a little bit. There are other seed sources you could pick on. But I think if we put together a group of people, and just said, look, we need to look at this, we need to do it, and sat down, we've got the people, so why not put a group together? Right?
Can I just add to that? Please. I think one of the concerns that one has when taking that approach is that if we just talk among the scientific community ourselves and try to convince NSF or NASA or whoever to fund this thing, it ends up becoming a zero-sum game because their budgets are controlled top-down, and funding that comes to ocean acidification or whatever is going to have to come out of their existing operating budget, which means other funded research becomes lower priority. The real issue here is not that we don't have really good ideas. The real issue here is we have too many good ideas and not enough money to implement things effectively. And so if we're going to talk about how do we get this done, it's got to be a grassroots effort. You've got to go out to the public. You've got to talk to your congressman. You've got to convince Congress that funding environmental research, environmental science is a critical priority that they need to address. Right now, NSF funding, there's a new decadal survey report out for NSF funding, and it's showing some very disturbing trend lines. Looking at the funding for investigator-based science over the last 20 years has been going down, 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 while the costs of infrastructure maintenance for the ships, all the infrastructure in which the research is done is going up, up, up. And in fact, 2015 represents a critical year in that cycle because we have just now crossed a threshold where the National Science Foundation is spending more to maintain the infrastructure than it is spending on the science to use that infrastructure to get things done, and it's only going to get worse. And if we continue in a sequestration mode where every budget cycle we lose another 5% off the top, it's not going to be very long where it isn't going to matter because we're not going to have any money to do anything with. And this isn't happening just at NSF, it's happening at NASA, it's happening at NOAA. The Navy, you can forget the Navy. They've been out of this business for a long time simply because they're more worried about buying bullets, bombs, and gasoline than they are about supporting the basic science research that the Navy used to do. The Navy used to support a lot of this stuff. They don't do it anymore. So the real issue is it's a political issue as much as anything else. The public has got to get behind funding basic science because knowledge and understanding is the only way out of this problem we're in.
Identify what the problem is. Is it going to be an impact on fisheries? And how is that going to impact humanity, and use that as sort of the base to work off of. Look at it from a human point of view. If we see these changes take place in the Bay, how is it going to impact the rest of the people who live in the Bay? And to identify the problem and work it, get the people involved who want to work on it.
My name is David Burdage. I'm in oceanography or OES or whatever they're calling us this week. I think Dick is spot on, and I think it's a bigger problem. I mean, trying to get money to do research in an environment where the Congress is anti-intellectual and anti-science, and they think that climate change is something that we've all perpetuated just because we're bored and have nothing better to do. I think that's the big problem. And that really worries me a lot, that there are people, and people seem to believe that because they elect these people. I mean, a couple of years ago, I started teaching a climate change class for 100 level kids because I really strongly felt that these guys are going to vote And if this is the last science class they take, well, I want to make sure they understand that this is a real problem. And I think that research is great. I've been doing it for 30 years, and I hope to do it, well, maybe 30 years more, but probably not. But I think at some point we know enough, and we have to say we need to do something, and we need to change the system so that we can get the money that's needed to fix the problems and answer the questions. And I don't know if that really wasn't a question as much as a soapbox, but you guys can comment on that.
More faith in our young people.
Well, I do too. That's why I'm teaching this class. But, you know, it's going to take a long time to get rid of the people that are making the decisions. I mean, look who's chair of the Senate Science and Whatever Committee, you know?
Yeah.
Science and Technology, yeah, whatever. I mean, these are the people that are in charge now.
You know, frustration aside, I really do understand it, but we can't give up. You know, we've got to keep moving on it. We've got to keep moving ahead.
I didn't say we shouldn't, but I'm just saying that I think that if we talk amongst ourselves and try to develop interdisciplinary projects and things like that, that's great. I've been involved in a lot of those, and I will continue to be involved in a lot of those. But I think we know the problem at a first-order level, and I think we know the trajectory we need to go in, and it's not in the right direction. And I think we need to spend more time trying to address that as much as we need to say, well, we really need another study to tell us blah, 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 blah. That's important, but it's not going to solve the problem.
Thank you. Other questions, other ideas?
My name is Lisa Horth, and I'm in biology at ODU. And so if we follow Dick's lead about thinking outside the box, my comment on that is, could we make venture capitalists interested? So we need a new source, right? We need a new source of funding, and Bill Gates is interested in health because we know that people die painful deaths from HIV infections. But what are the consequences of losing wetlands, and can we convince a businessman that's a smart man to invest financially? He needs some kind of payoff that works. And so that, I think, is the outside the box part. We need to come up with a solution for what that is. But that was not why I initially raised my hand. My initial hand raising was for a question or comment to Skip. And when I walk my dog over by St. Patrick's School, there's those condos that got developed. And usually when I'm walking there, I'm thinking about basic science. And so someone has restored a wetland there, and that's nice, and that seems to expand a bit. Simultaneously, you know, the condos have the ability to build right on the water there. So I ask why and how this can be to anybody I see that I think might know the answer. And the way I understand it is the volume of water there is not enough to impinge upon them to require them to have a permit, and so they're allowed to build there anyway. So every time I walk there, which I have a problem doing now because I see this irony, right? Why are we restoring the wetland in one section of this ecosystem while we're allowing building today, you know, not 10 years ago, but today on this other piece? And so I'm not going to blame you, but I'm wondering if you can help us prevent this, because perhaps it's legal, perhaps it's a favor. I've heard both things. If it's legal, it shouldn't be. If it's a favor, that's a harder thing to deal with. But
the reason those buildings are there is because there was a building there that had the same footprint and use that this one did, and therefore it did not have to go before the Planning Commission to have any of the zoning change. The density was right, the footprint was right, and so you could plunk down that building right there and not have to go through any of the environmental reviews and scrutiny that you would with a greenfield site. And that's it. That's what you get along developed shorelines. That's why you got this screwy marina going in up at East Ocean View, outside what's going to be the flood control structure for the city of Norfolk. Again, the Planning Commission had no right to look at that because it was by right zoned for what it was. And so this is the constant problem. The sort of legacy of the zoning and the legacy of those older structures in urban areas are very, very hard to fix. The only way you could have gotten out of that and changed it or down the zoning or pushed them back is to pay them. Because if they can by right develop that sucker right where it is, then you've got to pay them to do something different. The one thing they did get nailed on, and I was at the Wetlands Board when this came up, they were supposed to put a wetlands in front of it. And they stalled and hemmed and hawed. And then they went for the second section of condos next door. And when they went in for that wetlands permit, the Wetlands Board started asking them what happened to the first permit. And while they couldn't force them to do anything with the first permit, they sure as heck could hold up the second permit for a number of things, and that's what they did. So now there's some sprigs of Spartina going in along that shoreline, and they're at least restoring that shoreline, which will be drowned in, since they can't put the Spartina at the back end of the intertidal zone and get an extra 20 years out of it, it'll probably be gone in 15 years. But it's there for a while. But this is the big problem. This is why we do zoning work rather than wetlands work these days. And it's very frustrating when you run into sites like that.
I work with a citizens group, Lafayette Wetlands Partnership, and I've heard people talk here about multidisciplinary approaches, multi-agency approaches. The word public has crept in a couple times in terms of political support. I see a citizen in science poster here today. So I'm curious, gets me thinking about something that might be called crowdsourcing of data collection. I'm curious what role citizens might play in support of scientists in collecting data relating to wetlands, and if there's a role, what problems do we need to solve to improve how that's been done in the past?
I can jump on that. We have 3 projects going where we actually use volunteers from communities. And one of them's counting trees, that we've got 4,000 trees we planted that we have to monitor 3 times a year. We have some marsh dieback studies going on the eastern shore where we actually have volunteers come out and start monitoring. They're actually measuring density of plant species. So part of the process has been training these people that we've gone into. We've gone to groups, I'm trying to remember who, there's a bird group up in Gloucester who's doing a lot of the work in New Kent for us. And we have about 30 volunteers come out on the weekends and work in these sites. So we've used them quite extensively, as well as if you can get, they're enthusiastic as hell. That's the greatest thing about it. We have had no problems with data quality. We do have to check it, make sure. But we've had great success using volunteers and collecting the data, and some projects that we probably couldn't have afforded to do without the volunteers.
And I think technology is making that easier. At the last Ocean Optics conference I went to this fall, there were a couple of talks about using citizen science for water quality monitoring. And they were coming up with new techniques that involve nothing more than our cameras on our cell phones and a standardized card. So you take a picture of the water, you take a picture of the card, at the same time you upload it to a website, you've got it geotagged for a position and time, and because you've got a reference card of known reflectance, they can convert the color image of the water into an estimate of chlorophyll concentration or CDOM concentrations in the water. So now you have citizens going around just out on their boats, out on their fishing, walking along, just take a picture of wherever you are and upload it to the system, and it creates a network of opportunities to collect this kind of information. And the technology is getting easier and easier every minute to do these kinds of things. So yeah, I think there's lots of opportunity for citizen engagement in that kind of thing.
And I might add that one aspect of that is that having these citizen scientist programs does a very nice job of communicating the importance of science to the public and why we're doing science and why it's important for society, because frankly, most of us scientists have been poor communicators in the past. That's hopefully changing. But to address the earlier question about the anti-science, anti-intellectual groups that are out there in various settings, communication by scientists and engaging with the public, I think, is key to our future viability in the scientific community. And I think it's really important at universities that are now implementing communication programs that teach potential scientists, students of science, how to communicate properly and how to use their iPhones, for example, to create videos to explain how they're doing research, why that research is important, and what it means for society.
Let me jump on that as well. I think, Karen, I think that point is excellent. I think the more you can engage folks in this, the better, and also different communities. We have a flooding phone app that we've developed for people to go out and record where this flooding and sea level rise is. And the app is just a tool for us to get at millennials who won't come to meetings, busy people who have children and have normal lives and don't come to meetings, people who don't want to join. And if we can hook them into this network, we then can push messages back to them that are of use to us as an advocacy group. And I think that looking at citizen science as a way not just of getting the science done, but of getting the science funding done is critical. And I'll come out of the closet here. The 22 years that I spent in Congress, the last 10 years I spent was on the Science Committee, and we oversaw all of the accounts of the agencies we've been talking about. And the way we used to get votes was we would turn abstract things that nobody in their right mind would vote for, like a Large Hadron Collider, into a constituency issue. And this is how DOD does it. This is how they sell stupid things. They go out and they have nuts and bolts made in every congressional district so that they can get all of those people who make those nuts and bolts to write to Congress and go, hey, we need a B-2 bomber. And so I think we've got to think as well about how you turn this into a constituency issue so that the involved public that you are managing to network through these citizen science efforts, those groups are turned into advocacy networks for the kind of research that we need to get done.
Thank you.
Earlier, you talked about sort of reductionist, I think of it, reductionist science versus sort of a generalist approach, and I think that's a really important point that I think students need to think about. That, first of all, you're not going to get your PhD if you sort of try to solve all the world's problems, so you have to be a reductionist. But if you don't stop and think, why am I doing this? How does this fit into a bigger picture? You just become a horse with blinders. And I think that as we move into our careers, for some of us at least, it's maybe easier to do that. But I think if we can sort of train our students to sort of be, what's the word I want? Not schizophrenic in that regard, but bipolar in their scientific approach, that will be very valuable. So I like that comment a lot.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've learned recently, and that is that it has forced me to step back from my topics and to be able to explain it to the average person on the street. I've got to step back and look at the bigger picture. And when I was a student, I didn't think about that. I was focused on the minutiae of my research. But if students are being trained simultaneously in how to communicate and engage with the public, they're forced to step back and look at where their research fits into the bigger picture.
Show of hands for members of the Society of Wetland Scientists. Great, thanks. Now, can I see a show of hands, those who are not members? And those who are members, go around and kick them in the butt so they sign up?